You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hi, I'm Joe Heath.
I'm Toni Heath.
And this is the Watch-A-Thon of Rassilon.
A podcast.
That you're listening to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be doing our first ever interview.
Yeah.
Very cool. We've got with us today someone who actually worked on Doctor Who, Richard Starkings. Hello.
Hi there.
You are a comic book writer, letterer, an editor, and especially relevant to this podcast, you were the editor of the 7th Doctor comics, published in Doctor Who magazine.
I was.
Did you get it all?
Yeah, basically. So you did issues 134 to 155, which were released from February 1988 to November 1989. And then you wrote Cold-Blooded War as well.
Cold-Blooded War, over a plot by Gary Russell, yeah.
Very cool.
So, homework.
Yeah.
Gosh.
True facts! And we read all of the stuff you've worked on and written for Doctor Who. Well, not all the lettering, because you did a lot of lettering,
Yeah.
right?
I lettered a lot of 6th Doctor before I became the editor with 7th Doctor, yeah.
And then you did
and then
the new comics.
all the Titan stuff, which is sort of a whole other block of cheese.
Was that fun getting to letter that stuff, because you also got to, read it?
It was going through so fast. I mean, they were doing 4 books a month for about 2 or 3 years.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
So one of the secrets of lettering is that you pretty much forget what you just lettered when you're on the next job. So
right.
I do remember I thought Nick Abadzis did a great job. A lot of my friends worked on that. Boo Cook illustrated some Matt Smith stuff. He was my cover artist on Elephant Men. Dave Taylor. It was some beautiful, beautiful work. Rachel Scott. She was incredible at drawing the 12th Doctor. Roberta Ingranata did an incredible job on Jodie Whittaker. It was great that each Doctor attracted sort of the definitive artist, which has sort of been the way over the years. You know, like Dave Gibbons is sort of the definitive Tom Baker artist.
So you started working on the 6th Doctor?
I traded lettering assignments with Annie Parkhouse, who was then Annie Harfacree, in order to work on Doctor Who, which was sort of one of my dream jobs at the time, much to the chagrin of the editor, Sheila Cranner. But I basically offered Annie more work lettering my book, which was Action Force or G.I. Joe, to take Doctor Who off her hands. And yeah, I was a young upstart. That was my nickname at Marvel UK. So I sort of engineered being able to work on the strip because I loved Doctor Who, because I wanted to, work on the strip. So
how much Doctor Who have you consumed?
All of it.
All of it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Televised and expanded?
I did try with the audios. I listened to most of Paul McGann's early stuff when that was New Who. And then actually when New Who was announced, when the Eccleston series was announced, I know for a fact that it hurt the sales of Big Finish because people were buying the Big Finish audios because that was it. That was New Who. And sales dropped when the Eccleston series was announced, and then they slowly picked up again. And there's just too much audio. There's too much Doctor Who. I never read any of the New Adventures except the Russell T Davies one. I think I read a Mark Gatiss one, and a couple of others that had sort of a veneer of authenticity about them, either retroactively or at that time.
Like, what was that one? The one with the scarecrows. That was based on a book, I believe, right?
Human Nature, by Paul Cornell, who actually wrote to me as an 18-year-old when I was the editor of the strip, asking me how to become a writer. And I have no recollection of this. But Paul, I was at Gallifrey one year, the Los Angeles Doctor Who convention, and Stephen Moffat was there. This was the first year of New Who. And embarrassingly, Paul was explaining to Stephen Moffat how I'd encouraged him as a young writer and reinvented lettering in the digital sphere, and it was clear Stephen Moffat had no interest in him. But Paul, bless him, has been grateful to me ever since. He often mentions that I wrote back to him. He wrote me a letter. Back in the days when we wrote letters and editors could only communicate with freelancers through the mail, I apparently wrote him a very long letter encouraging him. And then he wrote the first strip that I didn't edit was written by Paul Cornell. It was, I think, called Stairway to Heaven.
Is that the one with Frobisher? Did you say it was before or after you wrote it?
It was after.
Oh,
It was the first
after.
one after. No, Frobisher was created by Steve Parkhouse.
Okay.
Brilliant writer.
I knew about Frobisher before getting into Doctor Who because we have a friend who loves penguins.
That's our friend Ray's
Right.
all-time favorite Doctor Who character is Frobisher.
He's a great character.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting that in your run, there's not a companion.
No, that was by design.
Mhm.
I actually got rid of the companion in the first story I edited because there was a story called Cold Day in Hell written by Simon Furman, who's a great writer, very solid, dependable writer who I worked on staff with. He was assistant editor on Transformers for a long time, and then he became the writer on Transformers. He's probably written more Transformers than any other writer. And Sheila had hired him to do a story, and I think they got the rights to the Ice Warriors. He introduced this character who was a heat vampire, which Ice Warriors, heat vampire. It worked in that story, and I was asked to take over editing the comic strip. Coincidentally, John Ridgway was leaving, costs on Doctor Who Monthly had gone up, sales had gone down, so I was encouraged to hire younger, cheaper artists.
Mm-hmm.
But the first thing I said to Simon was, okay, write me a story that makes it plausible that the Doctor's going to have a heat vampire as a companion that will work outside an Ice Warrior story, or write me a story where you write her out. And I picked the one where he wrote her out. She was like a fugitive and being tracked down. But I always felt that you don't need a companion in the comic strip. Firstly, because it was 8 pages a month. So I wanted as much Doctor as you could get. And
Right.
if the story allowed for a companion-like character, then have him or her in that scenario rather than dragging a heat vampire through Victorian London, which might have been interesting, but I also wanted to break with this tradition of having one writer write it all the time. That was not, to me, the format of the show. So why would it be the format of the comic strip? So I wanted a new writer and artist on every arc, in the way that you have a new writer and director on every story, So, yeah, that was, to me, if we couldn't get the current companion, and we could, but you had to pay more. And again,
Right.
sales were going down. It was the last years of Sylvester McCoy. So paying more for the likeness of a companion just didn't make sense. So, yeah, we got rid of the companion.
Speaking of, you said you got different writers. You got one of my favorite, Grant Morrison, which is fantastic.
Well, you say that, but at the time he was just Grant.
Yeah.
He was he'd written a story, The World Shapers, which was based on a misunderstanding he had about some continuity, which I think he admitted in an interview after the fact that he wrote the story that connected the Ward to the Cybermen, I think. Was that a 6th Doctor story? Yes, it was a 6th Doctor story. So I knew he liked Doctor Who, and I knew that he was available because he had not been snapped up by Vertigo at that point. Plus, I was working on Zoids, which was published as Spider-Man and Zoids. So Zoids was a toy property similar to Transformers, except they were robot dinosaurs on this planet called Zoidstar. And Ian Rimmer, who is the editor of the strip, was writing it. And Tom DeFalco came over from Marvel US and sort of said, well, you shouldn't be writing the strip you're editing. This was sort of the Jim Shooter days of Marvel Comics, where it was much more structured. They put an end to what was called the writer-editor because they felt like, a writer should be working with an editor, not represent both roles. So Ian actually had written Zoids for, 15 issues and was quite happy to shed the load. And I wrote a story, and then we actually bugged Ian to hire Grant, myself and John Tomlinson, who was an art editor over there. We were all reading Swamp Thing at the time, written by Alan Moore, and what was interesting is that a lot of storylines in Zoids seemed to echo Alan's Swamp Thing stories. There was definitely, Grant was reading Swamp Thing too, and sort of ideas and conceits about how the story was told were echoed. So it was very much the days when Alan Moore had changed the way comics were written. And of course he wrote some Doctor Who backup strips back in the old days of Doctor Who Weekly. But Grant was a really hard-working and imaginative writer. He did a little story for me for Action Force where I wanted to use Master of Kung Fu as a backup in Action Force. So he wrote a little story where Quick Kick reminisces about his old teacher Shang-Chi to connect the G.I. Joe and Marvel universes. And I know that he went to his comic book store and bought up back issues of Master of Kung Fu as research for a 5-page throwaway strip. And that was the first time he worked with Steve Yoel, who he went on to work with on Zenith and even The Invisibles. So a lot of Grant's early working relationships were actually forged at Marvel UK. And Brian Hitch, young Brian Hitch, worked on the one story he did for me, that Grant Morrison did for me. And I remember I wrote to Grant when he lived at 20 Huntley Gardens in Glasgow. I can remember his address because I sent so many packages to him. He doesn't live there now.
It is important that we say that.
But I said, I want a Doctor Who story where he encounters something completely alien. And Grant wrote back, well, if he does that, then he'll suffocate on page 1 because it won't be a breathable atmosphere. But then he came up with this really interesting story where it's sort of a submolecular story. I can't even remember what it was called. Do you remember?
Culture Shock.
Culture Shock, So in fact, that's what he did, is like Culture Shock. It was I think most writers like to have an idea to sort of bounce off of. That may,
like a prompt.
That may even have been one of his last stories for Marvel UK before the door at Vertigo opened wide.
You were talking about that Master of Kung Fu sort of combining.
Oh, we got to talk about.
Yeah, we got to talk about Death's Head. Yeah.
Oh, I was all in favor of. So tell me I can't do something, and I want to do it more. It wasn't just Death's Head. We had the Sleaze Brothers. I introduced some metamorphs called Gwanzulam, and they weren't just in Doctor Who, where we used them as a Seven Doctor story. They were also in Ghostbusters, Thundercats, and I think in Robocapers. I think Lou Stringer, who was a cartoonist who did little backup strips, I think I had him design them. We weren't allowed to create a shared universe, so I was like, well, we can suggest that there's a shared universe. And actually that Sleaze Brothers strip cannot be reprinted because the Sleaze Brothers was an Epic comic, had an Epic contract. John Carnell and Andy Lanning, who are friends of mine that created Sleaze Brothers, own the copyright, so you won't see that one reprinted. You have to hunt down that issue of DWM.
That's the one where the meddling monk has a toilet TARDIS.
Yeah. Well, that's Andy. Andy Lanning's got a great sense of humour. John too.
I think it's definitely the funniest one out of the runs.
Yeah, and we had 3 or 4 artists on that. I think it may even have been a deadline buster that we how do we get this done quickly? Which was often the case, even though I was pretty far ahead with Doctor Who because it was black and white. And when I was handed the strip, being able to work with 3 different writers meant I could get 3 different stories going. And in fact, John Ridgway was upset because he thought there wasn't enough work. And he's like, well, how come you've just commissioned 6 months worth of work? So Sheila had him come back to do a story called Echoes of the Mogor shortly after. And Dan Abnett wrote that one, another writer who's gone on to great things. But Death's Head, though, was actually solving a problem. Death's Head was the size of a transformer, which is like, huge, 150 feet tall, whatever they are. And we wanted him to be human-sized because he was getting his own comic. This is the fun of working in, Marvel offices, that we were just knocking around ideas, and one of us said, it's a pity we can't use the Master's compression eliminator. And was like, well, why can't we? We can do anything. I'm editor of both strips. So I'm not sure they'd be able to reprint that one. I'm not sure if they have reprinted that. In the Death's Head book, I don't think they reprint that one. And we also did a crossover with Fantastic Four, which ultimately led to Death's Head working for the Time Variance Authority, because Walt Simonson loved drawing the character. I got him to draw a cover, and Walt liked drawing him so much, he put him in one of his issues of Fantastic Four that introduced the Time Variance Authority, which you do know is based on the TVA here in Tennessee.
Is it? I did not know that.
Walt's dad used to work for the TVA here.
I've constantly thought
I
that
was
while
gonna
watching
say,
how
Loki.
could you
It's
not?
driven me
Yeah.
crazy that they're the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, he posted that recently when Loki season 2.
And like Loki,
going
the
on?
TV show, is the most like next to Doctor Who, the most Doctor Who show on
Yeah,
TV.
especially the finale of season 2 was so Moffat.
Yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Does that mean that the Doctor is now officially a part of the Marvel Universe?
There was going to be a crossover with Doctor Strange, the two Doctors.
Oh, that makes sense.
Nice.
And there was a piece of artwork which you can probably find online. It's in one of my albums on Facebook. Lee Sullivan, this is after I stopped editing the strip. John Freeman became the editor. And there was a lot of crossover work with Marvel at the time. Sort of Marvel UK, the editor-in-chief was Paul Neary, who was an artist who'd worked on Captain America and other titles. He did a lot of books that crossed over with the X-Men, Wolverine, you name it. And I know, because I was living in New York at the time and I was working with Bob Harris, who's the editor of the X-Men, that Bob was not happy about it but couldn't do anything about it. And I think the mistake they made with Doctor Who, Doctor Strange was they asked for permission. I never asked for You know,
Right.
So I just did Death's Head as a crossover. I think we may have asked somebody internally, can we do this? Why not? You know. And those days, you know, there weren't any trade paperbacks in those days. Trade paperbacks were a mid to late 90s concept, whereas all the Titan Doctor Who strips, the whole idea was to put them in those hardcovers.
Right.
You know, because Titan knew that they could sell those into newsagents in the UK and into W.H. Smiths and Waterstones. And I'm sure that when Matt Smith was riding high, that, you know, those books sold really, really well. And they did oversized hardcover editions. You know, the whole idea with Titan's series was book collections, you know, build up a graphic novel line. And they did like 30 or 40 of them. I mean, there's a lot of collections. And yes, we lettered all of them.
So how did you? We know how you got into Doctor Who, which is weaseling your way in. How did you? How did you get into lettering in the first place?
I didn't weasel my way in.
Wow, Joseph.
The name of my studio is Comic Craft. I was crafty.
Oh, okay.
How did I get into comics? Or
Yeah. How did you get into
Lettering.
Yeah.
That goes back to a magazine called Warrior, which gave birth to V for Vendetta, Miracle Man / Marvel Man. It was the brainchild of Des Skin, who of course launched Doctor Who Weekly, and they ran articles about how to get into comics. That was sort of number one. You know, I never had a plan B. I was like, I am going to work in comics. And in one of the articles, he said, well, you know, one of the easy ways to get in is to take up lettering. And I was like, I already do that at school in my, you know, my rough book. So I had been drawing Doctor Who comic strips for the monthly magazine of the Doctor Who Appreciation Society. And that was called Who and Crew. And I did 100 comic strips. It was not only in TARDIS, it was in Doctor Who Bulletin, which was a sort of rival fanzine at the time. This was when the quality of fanzines was getting better and better because
I
printing...
got more stuff to read now.
I was basically drawing that comic strip to practice my lettering. I sent those to a lot of different comic book publishers, got some work on a comic called Whizzer and Chips, lettering a 4-page strip about Captain Kidd, who was a pirate that was a baby. That's the kind of stuff you get in British comics. Deskin gave me it was an Italian reprint. These were in the latter days of Warrior. But ultimately that led me to lettering Transformers and other work for Marvel UK. And because I was going into the office every week, I eventually got offered the job that I'd been turned down for a few months earlier. You know, I loved comics. The first comic I really loved was Countdown, which featured John Pertwee's Doctor Who comic strip. And it was beautifully drawn either by Harry Lindfield or Jerry Haylock. These were great illustrators of that time. Jerry Haylock also illustrated Land of the Giants for a Joe 90 comic, which I also loved. And just the quality of illustration in those British weeklies was so high that you couldn't not buy those comics. Most people my age remember Countdown, which became TV Action, and also Look-In, because the great artists were working on those books. 2000 AD didn't come out till 1977. Countdown and Look-In were 1971. So if you were looking for good comic strips, that's where you could find them. Then 2000 AD sort of blew the doors open and just reinvented.
Right.
It was the punk rock movement in comics, 2000 AD. It just made everything else look ridiculous. It was artists like Brian Bolland, Kevin O'Neill, Dave Gibbons, Ian Gibson, Mick McMahon, who had been exposed to French comics, American comics, British comics, and sort of fused it all together, whether it was in Judge Dredd or Strontium Dog or Robo Hunter or Ghostbusters. It's hard to explain. It was kind of like what Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko did to American comics in 1962. Mm-hmm. In 1977, John Wagner, Pat Mills, Dave Gibbons, Brian Bolland, Mick McMahon did the same for us. It was like, whoa, we've never seen comics like this. This is what I want to read. I started reading Star-Lord, which merged into 2000 AD, but it was, again, I couldn't believe the quality of the work, and that there were 6 pages, not 2. Mm-hmm. In Look-In and Countdown, it was 2 or 3 pages. Then suddenly, 2000 AD has 6 pages of Judge Dredd, or 6 pages of Strontium Dog by Carlos Ezquerra, who also co-created Dredd. I think without 2000 AD, without Warrior, I might not have really had this sort of burning desire to get to work in comics. But I say that, but I was reading Marvel comics, when I was 8 or 9, because my brother had a collection of 7,000 American comics, wow. Which in the 70s, to have 7,000, that was a big thing.
I mean, it's still a lot.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about Time and Tide. That's the first one you wrote.
Probably, yes. Yeah.
Also, fun fact, it was the most recent comic that was released when I was born. So I don't know if that makes
when you were born?
Yeah. I was born.
I doubt whether you read it when it was published then.
No. I was born March 1989. And that
89. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that was my last year at Marvel UK too. Yeah, that Dougie Braithwaite wanted to draw Doctor Who. Dougie, who actually I'm working with right now on Conan the Barbarian, was just a great artist who was very young. He was still a teenager when he drew that one. He was 15 when he did his first work for me. He was 17 when he drew that Doctor Who strip.
Whoa.
And he draws like a professional these days. He's as good then as he is now. He probably would say different. But...
I thought the art was amazing in that one. Very comedic too.
Yeah, Dougie's got a great sense of humor. We did a Ghostbusters that was called Ghost Rapping, and it was a rap. And if you can find that online, it's still funny today. We did it all in rhyme, and no sleep, we're busting. It was, yeah.
I gotta find that.
Yeah. So I think I wrote it for Dougie, and I wrote it with John Carnell, who was the writer on the Sleaze Brothers. It's interesting. In those days, I didn't have the courage to write it all myself. I think I had John come in to the office on a Saturday. I often worked through the weekend. And we just sat and, made it up.
Who came up with the initial concept? Was it you or him?
I have no idea.
A literal lifetime ago for me.
It's entirely your lifetime ago, so I don't feel bad for not really remembering.
Joe, which parts of Road Trippy did you write?
That's a good
you don't
question.
know.
Yeah.
Well, when you're working together, you can often forget because you're having a conversation, writing it up in real time. So if I wrote it up, and I probably did, I probably typed it up because I was a fast typist at that time. That sort of process of it coming in my ear and going onto the page might make me think I did most of the work. But, often the person doing the talking is doing most of the work. And you're, as an editor, when you're working with someone and you're typing it up, you're sort of editing it as it goes into your ear. I just can't remember. I know I probably came up with the idea. It was set on a water planet that was drowning or something, and the creatures there were becoming amphibious or were. Yeah, just can't remember.
What was it you were saying about it?
About...
The Warrior.
Oh, the Warrior, that's right, yeah. He was the sort of mentor on the planet. Yeah.
I just was taking it personally.
As someone who worries?
I'm the warrior.
Are you a warrior?
Yeah.
I'm a warrior too, so that probably came from me. No, that came from John. I think I said he's the warrior. Oh, you know it.
Who knows?
Who knows? Yeah.
No, but Joe was getting on to me about worrying, and he's like, we just read this comic, and I was like, yeah, but he's the only one who lives, so
yeah,
maybe
that's
it's
true.
fine.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to worry about things.
Yeah.
You know, I've been watching Naked and Afraid on Max. You know that show where they drop a naked woman and a naked man into like the African desert, and they have to survive and work together. Usually, there's a type A macho guy who's like, "I'm going to dominate Mother Nature." And then there's a hippie girl who's going, maybe that's not the right approach. Maybe we should be considerate, you know. And I think that's the warrior aspect of, you know, and often the macho guys, you know, break their knees, you know, cut themselves, hacking down bamboo. So, yeah, a more cautious approach is...
There's this idea in kind of post-apocalyptic storytelling, but also like prepping. I don't know if you're familiar with prepping at all. Okay, so there are people who do just like prepare for apocalypse situations. I don't mean in like fiction. I mean like
survivalists.
Yeah.
Doomsday preppers.
Yeah.
Doomsday preppers who like hoard stuff. But then there are also people who, because I find it very interesting, I've read a lot of like prepping blogs, but there's this idea of like the people who like hoard like guns and ammo and stuff aren't going to have anything on the people who know how to make soap and farm and...
Yeah, and a lot of those Naked and Afraid people who are soldiers, without their backpacks, without their team, you know, without a unit, without a gun, they fall to pieces because they don't know how to dig a well and get water out of the ground. They don't know how to eat vegetation. You know, and there's another show, Alone, which we're also watching on Hulu, where a lot of the women that sign up for those are just constantly eating greens. And the men are like, God, we should catch a fish or kill a pig. And it's like, you're surrounded by nutrients.
Actually,
and
if
you're
you
not
know just the
touching them.
smallest amount about foraging, you're probably in better shape.
Yeah, foraging is a good way to go. But no, I kind of, in these days in which we live, I do think I do not know enough about surviving. But actually, that's one of the problems I had with Walking Dead, both the comic and the show. They don't do any prepping. They don't do any real surviving. Mm-hmm. It's driven by how many zombies you're going to shoot in the head this episode. And when Robert was about 30 or 40 issues in, I said, have you seen the TV show Survivors? And he said, oh, you're not the first person to mention that. It's like, because in Survivors, it's a very similar scenario. It's a post-apocalyptic, you know, it's a pandemic. But what is great about that show, which was created by Terry Nation, second episode of the first Dalek story is called The Survivors.
Oh.
You know, so, because the files were the survivors, you know. So the survivors didn't just show you the pandemic. It's like, well, how do we survive? How do we make a candle?
Yeah.
You know, how do we burn fuel so we can we've moved into these houses. How do we keep them warm? How do we farm? How do we trade? Who do we trust? And I think Walking Dead missed out on that aspect of it. And actually, I was talking about this to someone yesterday, and they said, yeah, and look at all those manicured lawns. You know, 10 years into the zombie apocalypse, and you see all these beautifully manicured lawns. Who's mowing the lawns? The zombies?
Or even just the people are like, just, you know, their hair's really nice, they have makeup on.
Yeah, not enough dirt on their faces. Just watch Naked and Afraid. Day 15, they're filthy.
I know, when I watch, like, post-apocalyptic things, like, I know specifically with Zombieland, I was like, every place they go to has electricity. Power. That's not going to happen if the whole world's been messed up.
I mean, that's...
But we are entertained.
We are entertained, yes.
I think about this a lot. Because I think my, like, pandemic hobby was like, oh no, if everything really does go to shit, what do we do? That's when I, like, got into, like, survivalist, like, reading survivalist blogs and stuff like that, and seeing what other people do. And there was kind of this, like, divergent ideology. There was, like, a group of people who's like, it's gonna be community. Yeah. Like, you can't learn everything. You might not know how to make a candle, but you find the person who does.
There will always be a loner. There's always a lone wolf. There's always that character, even in a real situation.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely.
But community, you know, people will actually start talking to each other again and learning from each other, which, you know, is our basic default.
Back to Doctor Who for a
Yes,
second.
I took us wildly off course.
So the new specials, the 60th specials, there was the Star Beast, which is based on a comic.
Yep.
So I was wondering, of the Doctor Who comics you've worked on, which one would you most like to see turn into an
Nemesis
episode?
of the Daleks. In fact,
so
they did put a shot of Absalom Dark in Time Heist. There's a screen where it runs through a bunch of criminals, and the shot of Absalom Dark is actually a drawing by Lee Sullivan, who illustrated the story Nemesis of the Daleks. When I was reading Doctor Who Weekly back in the day, and they had this backup featuring Absalom Dark, I was like, this is a great character, somebody who hates the Daleks because, well, he's basically a criminal, a murderer, a rapist, who is given the choice of death or DK, and DK is Dalek Killer. So he chooses DK, and then he falls in love with the princess and the Daleks killer, and then he wants revenge on the Daleks. And then they did a group called Star Tigers, which I was never fully on board with, because I thought he was a great loner character. So in Nemesis of the Daleks, we killed the other ones. Then Paul Cornell brought them back, which that's the truth. But there was actually a character, I think, in one of the Dalek serials for the 6th Doctor or 7th Doctor called Orsini, and he had a ponytail, and I thought, oh, this is Absalom Dark in TV form. But now that they've done the Star Beast, I don't see why they couldn't do Absalom Dark, you know. And he's not my character. I didn't create him. Steve Moore and Steve Dillon created him, and Steve Dillon, of course, went on to much greater things. But everything Steve touched turned to gold because he just had such incredible talent. You know, he really drew characters that looked real and expressed emotions. He was a natural. He did Preacher with Garth Ennis, and he did a run on Punisher with Garth Ennis. Brilliant artist. Lovely, lovely man too, you know, gone too soon. He was only 53. But I thought Absalom Dark was a great character. And when he popped up in Time Heist, I was like, doors open. You know, and then when they did Star Beast, it's like, well, it's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
You know, and Nemesis of the Daleks, I always thought was a great title. Mm-hmm. And I came up with that, I think, before Silver Nemesis, you know. Wow. And then I thought, oh, now they've used it for the Cybermen.
Well, and if we know one thing about Doctor Who, they've never had titles that sound at all similar.
I actually had a rule when I was editing the comic strip that it had to be the something of something.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So Claws of the Clarthy, Nemesis of the Daleks, Echoes of the Mogor, Time and Tide broke the rule. Of course,
the one you wrote.
I'm allowed to break my own rule. Yeah, but I also wrote Nemesis of the Daleks. So, but Nemesis of the Daleks was to me a great sort of. It was sort of based on Star Wars in that the Dalek space station is blown up at the end, and in my story, Absalom Dark dies at the end of that, and then of course Paul brought him back. How dare he? It's a shame that so many post-Genesis stories revolve around Davros. You know, the solution to that is a character like Absalom Dark, where you're so into his desire for revenge on the Daleks that he propels the plot. You know, and the Doctor becomes, you know, a passenger in that story. And that's the thing that I liked about not having a companion, is it allowed the Doctor to be a passenger in somebody else's story, whereas the Russell T Davies approach is that the Doctor's a passenger in a companion story. You know, I mean, what's the title of the first Russell T Davies episode? Mm-hmm. Rose. You know, what's the title of the first Judy Gatwa episode? Church on Ruby Road.
Yeah.
You know, he nails his colours. He's very upfront always about what the story is about. It's in the title, you know. Even, you know, Partners in Crime, Doctor and Donna, Smith and Jones.
Smith and Jones.
You know, so he's very much, this is a show about the Doctor, and whereas Moffat is like, oh, we're just going to kill all the companions.
Over and over and
very
over again.
different. I remember when I was at San Diego the year Moffat took over, and there was a Doctor Who panel in Hall H, back in the days when you could get in Hall H, and Moffat said, you know, I know a lot of you out there are worried that my approach to Doctor Who is going to be dark, tough. And it was. I mean, if you think about it, you know, that whole sequence in The Giggle where the toy maker says, poor little Amy Pond, you know, and poor little Clara, she's killed by a bird. That to me was Russell T Davies saying, look what happened when I was away. Moffat killed all the companions. You know, Danny Pink wasn't in there, but he was practically a companion. He died.
That's right.
He was ruthless. You know, what's with all the Cybermen finales? There are other villains available.
I feel that way about the Daleks sometimes too. So
I do sometimes.
I think they're contractually obliged to use the Daleks once a season.
Yeah.
I should ask my friend Sue, who works for the Terry Nation estate, because there isn't a season without Daleks.
That is just a fascinating rights issue.
I think when they were negotiating, that was part of the negotiations when we were going to get the Toclafane instead of the Daleks in season 1. I think it was probably, well, we want the Daleks to appear in every season. They probably said every episode.
That was probably the first ask, yeah.
But that's why, Absalom Dark would be a great addition, because he is the nemesis of the Daleks, and making the Doctor the one that's angry at the Daleks every time gets boring.
Right.
Well, that's also interesting. How did what's it called? Up Above the Gods happen? Because that's another one where
I sort of dreamt that. So I was living in Los Angeles. I think I had read Emperor of the Daleks, which was Paul's story. I just went to bed one night and I was like, well, we're missing a bit of the story here. How did the Doctor convince the Davros to get involved? So I was like, well, this could be I'm impressed that you found that one. This could
do my research.
Yeah, this could be a story in the TARDIS. So actually, I called Lee Sullivan and said, if I write this, will you draw it? Because I didn't want some random artist drawing it. I wanted another fan. And Lee, I've said this before. If I'd stayed in London at Marvel UK, I would have just hired Lee to draw every episode. So I would have changed my policy because Lee was a fan. Lee could draw likenesses. Lee loved Doctor Who. Lee understood all my references to old TV21 comics, which we definitely tapped into on Nemesis of the Daleks. And he's just a lovely, lovely human being. Then I left, and I don't think I think he got to draw Emperor and Mark of Mandragora. He did some other ones, but not as the regular artist. He is the regular artist now. After 30 years, he drew Liberation of the Daleks. So with Up Above the Gods, I always thought it would be interesting to see Davros's origin, where he's blown up and his legs are, his arms and legs are blown off. And actually I have that page where Colin Baker's Doctor is whispering into Davros's ear.
It's beautifully drawn.
Yeah, and again, that was it. When you can write for an artist, you know what you're going to get. Mm-hmm. And also, I was friends with Gary Russell, who was the editor and was a big comic strip fan. So I pitched it to him. It's funny because I think he wrote back and said, well, this doesn't feel like something that would be on the show. And I was like, yeah, but it's the comic strip. And you're always saying how the comic strip isn't taken seriously. So why can't we do this? And then he was like, okay, fine.
I think it's really good. It's very
I didn't expect, I wasn't chomping at the bit to write the comic strip. I just went to bed with an idea, woke up, called Lee, wrote it up, and it was done.
Joe and I sat down and read all these together. And we read that one, and he's like, we're not reading what comes after that. And I was like, what? I was mad. I was like, you need to go find the rest of it.
And I think they reprinted it with Emperor of the Daleks, because it is a sort of prologue to Emperor of the Daleks, or it happens in between episodes or something. I can't remember. I just remember they brought back Absalom Dark, and actually I think Paul said, oh yes, it seemed to me like you changed some of my story. And I was like, you mean like bringing back characters I killed in my story? And he went, oh, good point. So he's a very gentlemanly guy, Paul Connell.
I think we've talked pretty much about the entirety of your comic strip run, but what about Cold-Blooded War? How did that come about?
Gary couldn't meet the deadline.
Oh no!
Had already plotted it. I don't think he'd fully plotted it. He'd done 8 pages, I think, and he had a bare outline for the story. The funny thing is that, so I had to finish the script from his thin outline. I think Gary sends everything he does to his mum, and his mum called him and said, oh, I read that Cold-Blooded War that you sent me, and I understood that one. And he said, oh, you understood the one I didn't write. He'll correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty certain that's what he told me. And it was nice to write the Doctor and Donna. It's very, I was a bit nervous about doing it, because once you write your own characters, you're like, well, I have to get these characters' voices right. Oh my gosh, the Doctor and Donna are so easy to write. They, if you've watched it enough, and I have watched every New Who episode at least 5 or 6 times, if you've watched it enough, it's very easy to hear. I think I added that, little Doctor and Donna sort of interaction at the end that was a little bit more
with the stick.
But yeah. If you want to talk, I think.
Cute.
Yeah.
Did you slip in the second Doctor reference with Donna saying, "Oh, my giddy aunt"?
Yes.
Very nice.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, how long ago is that? That's 10th Doctor. It's at least 15 years ago.
It's been very bizarre having 14 and just being like, I'm watching Donna and
there is a part of me, I mean, I really enjoyed the specials, but there is a part of me where I feel like Russell T Davies is just forcing back the clock.
Yeah.
And even, I was watching Star Beast yesterday, I was thinking, when Donna said, I don't want to forget you, when the 10th Doctor forces Donna to forget, I was always like, is that Russell who's being forced to forget, like he doesn't want to leave Doctor Who, really? And then,
he doesn't want to go.
Doesn't want to go, and I think there was an element of that. And I think all the showrunners, I think Stephen Moffat found it very hard to leave, because, he nearly left twice.
Yeah.
And then he came back and wrote another season. It's like, no, you didn't have to. You wanted to. But I can imagine that, and all writers are gods of their own worlds, even if that world is somebody else's. It's this thing about ownership. You have to take ownership, and I think Russell T Davies has to come back and say, I need to find my way in, and the way I'll find my way in is I'll finish this story with the Doctor and Donna.
Yeah.
And I think Moffat did the same thing. I mean, Moffat rebooted the show. He started with a blank slate. He did not inherit a companion. And he did pretty much the same when Peter Capaldi came on board, except he did have Clara, but you don't really think of Clara as Matt Smith's companion. It really is.
No, yeah.
I always say that, you have to be arrogant to be a writer, because you're telling people what the rules of the world are. Mm-hmm. So you need a writer like Stephen Moffat to come in and say, it's going to be dark, tough luck, Chris Chibnall comes in, it's going to be slow, tough luck, and I'm a big fan of what Chris Chibnall did, because I like variety. I think every new episode of Doctor Who is like a Christmas present. I'm not going to complain about how many Christmas presents I get.
Fair enough. You're a little more generous to Chibnall than I am. But
well, I like the Timeless Child storyline, and I think Russell probably did too, because even in sort of doing this whole bi-generation thing, making something fresh is the hardest task of all. And I was a bit worried that Tennant and Tate would feel like warmed leftovers.
Right.
It didn't, because the bigger budget, and it was worth it for The Wild Blue Yonder, which I think is one of the best episodes.
So good.
Have you seen the Unleashed episodes? Yeah. The first special, when it came out, and there's a bit where Russell's talking about, that's what he's saying, like, it's always important to be doing something new. And I was like, man, it is absolutely bold to be like, we're going back to what we did before, and that's never been done before. Incredible.
But I liked that Donna knew, because she was the Dr. Donna. She knew, she shared a sort of understanding of what the Doctor had been through. And in Wild Blue Yonder, when he talks about the flux, it was adding to that sort of weight. Let's remember the Time Lord Victorious, that, the Doctor was getting too full of himself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think this was sort of an extension of that, and, needs a good slap.
Yeah.
I love you, get out. That was one of my favourite lines when Ncuti, just says, I'm done with you now.
Yeah.
I'm the Doctor, get out of here.
It does feel like a palate cleanser between eras. Like, what's going to be completely
and of course the
Ncuti
season is season 1.
Yeah.
So I think when Russell T Davies reviews this, on some Blu-ray extra at the end of his next 4 years, he'll probably say, I needed to reboot it again.
Yeah.
And it did need rebooting, because sometimes I was like, wow, this is New Who, and it's weighed down by its own continuity.
Yeah.
Because it is older than Doctor Who was when the Three Doctors came out. And when the Three Doctors came out, I just thought Doctor Who was ancient. But that was only the 10th anniversary.
Was that an anniversary special during your run, the one with all the Doctors in it?
The 7 Doctors. Was that an anniversary? Maybe it was 25. Maybe it was around that time. No, that would have been... Yeah, no, it's probably the 25th, yeah. I don't remember, but you got to remember they weren't really the Doctors. They were metamorphs.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But I just wanted Lee to get the opportunity to draw them all.
That shot where they're all lined up.
Yeah.
Love that
That's
shot.
good.
Yeah, it's very good.
Yeah.
Just want to mention that because I really liked it. They look like them. So sometimes that's hard to do.
And actually the key was that Lee was a big fan of the comic strips, and he knew, find the artist that figured out how many lines you need to draw John Pertwee's face or, Pat Troughton's face. So he referenced the artist that got it right in order to get it right, because that was a lot of work for him. But he loved it. He loved it.
Me too. So why did you leave Doctor Who?
Because I chased a girl to America.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah.
That happens.
So, there was an American girl who was working in reception at Marvel. She went back to California. I've realized now that I'm the age I am, every 5 years I need to be doing something different.
You need a
I've
reboot.
been at Marvel for 5 years. So I sort of realized I'd done everything I wanted to do. I had launched comics aimed at the American market. That's Dragon's Claws, Death's Head, and Sleaze Brothers. Sleaze Brothers was even an epic comic. And I was like, well, what more can I do? They'd struggled to get books into the American market for years. And in my third, fourth year, I'd done it. So I moved to New York, did a lot of lettering for Marvel US. Hated it, because I was sort of in between, moved to California, broke up with the girl that I'd chased out there, and then I was like, okay, what am I going to do? So I worked at Graffiti Designs, which was a merchandise company based in Anaheim. Worked there for a couple of years and learned how to use the Mac back in the day when Macs were tiny, 12-inch screens, and that sort of opened the door for me to pioneer digital comic book lettering, which I did throughout the 90s. And, I continued to work for Marvel until other letterers figured out how to do computer lettering, But my studio's been going over 30 years now. But I never wanted to be just a comic book letterer. I like making comics.
Right.
I don't care what I'm doing. Increasingly, I do. I want complete control, which makes me very difficult to work with sometimes. But, I've had the joy of working with top creators in comics. I've worked with Brian Bolland, I've worked with Tim Sale, I've worked with Mike Mignola, I've worked, just a who's who of people who work in mainstream comics. But what I really wanted to do was make my own comics. So ultimately, the 90s were just me finding a way of creating an income stream whereby I could make my own comics.
Was Hip Flask the first one?
Flask, yes. I did a comic strip called Hedge Backwards, which was a sort of a gag strip. It was sort of about me moving to California, and it was published in the El Segundo Herald and then in a Buddhist newspaper called the World Tribune at the beginning of the 90s. And then Comic Craft just sort of stopped me drawing. I became human resources for my own company. Once you've got... I had 15, 16 people working for me at one point. That took a lot of the pleasure out of it because I was basically in charge. I loved working at Marvel because somebody else was in charge and we were mischief. We were like, let's do a crossover between Doctor Who and Thundercats. So you're able to sort of bottle that mischievousness and get away with it at somebody else's expense. And
hard to do when it's your own expense.
When it's your own expense, when people are working for you, and you're the one with the vision, and you're the one that people complain about because you make people work long hours and make them do things again. It's tough. Anybody that has high standards knows how hard it is to get other people to reach those high standards. I'm very, very lucky in that I worked with John Rochelle, who came to me out of UCLA as a design graduate. And he and I worked together. We still work together. He now handles the font side of our business and has his own font business. I concentrate on making comics and continuing with Comic Craft. He and I have worked together over 30 years, and we've never had a fight. We've never, he had high standards and he wanted to meet high standards. And it's rare to find someone that you're simpatico with. I've been very lucky to work with Tim Sale, who became one of my best friends, and I lettered everything he drew in the last 25 years of his life, and it didn't really hit me that was the case until he passed away. So it's great when you're able to work with people that you see eye to eye with, but creative people aren't known for seeing eye to eye with each other all the time. So, yes, Hip Flask was the first, and Hip Flask is Elephant Men. It's the same world. I actually changed the name because people would say Hip Flash. I was like, what's Hip Flash? Well, it's Hip Flask, and it's his name. Well, okay. The second issue of Hip Flask was called Elephant Men, and Bob Harris called me and said, "That's it, Elephant Men. That's the name of your book." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And he was right, because nobody asked. They say, "Why is the lead character a hippo?" And then I have that conversation. Well, Elephant Men is a derogatory term for all the human-animal hybrids. So once you've got people in, if they can't say it, it's amazing how it chases people away. But the other thing is, people love elephants. And they're sort of magnetized to the image of an elephant.
Man, that's not wrong.
Well, because elephants have very human-looking eyes. They have long lashes. They have all those sort of crinkly character lines. And there's something gentle about the way they move when they're not charging you. Just using the word Elephant Man. And The Elephant Man is one of my favorite movies. And yes, John Hurt is my favorite Doctor.
Good choice. I was going to ask that question.
It's true. I just think that in one episode he was the most doctorish Doctor of all.
Well, he's kind of like symbolizing the entire run of Classic Who.
Yeah.
Not just Classic Who, he symbolises New Who, which is that angst, that sort of weighty. When he's carrying the moment in a bag, that's all Doctor Who continuity for 50 years.
Right.
When he says Time Lords of Gallifrey, Daleks of Skaro, he has a gravitas. But I was a big fan of him. He's in so many of my favourite films. Alien, The Elephant Man.
I immediately think of Hellboy.
Yeah. Absolutely. And he's great in Hellboy.
I think he added like a lot of depth to that character that maybe wasn't necessarily even in the comics. So.
Yeah. And we won't mention Crystal Skull, but I guess I just did. But he's in that one too. He's in a lot of great genre films.
I just want to know what you're reading right now.
I'm reading Billy Summers by Stephen King.
Ooh.
Nice.
Which is a crime story. I used to read a lot of Stephen King.
Joe's making his way through it in order.
Stephen King? I think that's smart, because part of me wants to go back and read the ones I've missed. I think I gave up around Tommyknockers, which I really liked. Actually, no, I gave up halfway through It. It was just too long. And I think I needed to read something else. But I'm really enjoying Billy Summers. I actually got halfway through The Outsider and then watched the TV show and thought, well, the TV show wasn't very good. I don't need to finish the book. But probably the book was better, because there's very few Stephen King adaptations that are as good as, the exceptions being Green Mile is a brilliant film. Shawshank is brilliant. Dead Zone is brilliant. Even the Dead Zone TV show was pretty good.
I like the Gerald's Game.
Misery. Gerald's Game was good. The Tommyknockers TV show was okay, but he's just written too many books. It's hard to keep up, and there's other things I want to read. And comics, I'm reading Petrolhead by Rob Williams and Pai Pa, who are 2000 AD alumni. It's an Image comic. Incredible artwork. If you've not looked at Petrolhead, please do. I mean, I read a lot, and I'm constantly reading. I try to read a comic a day. I read anything Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips do. I read Fires of Pompeii, the novelization that came out. I usually just put them on the shelf. I read all the Target books when they came out until the very last Target novelization came out. I read the Douglas Adams ones.
The Rose one's pretty good.
If it's the writer of the show, I will read it. So Fires of Pompeii, check that box, because it's adapted by James Moran. There's extra bits in that. It's worth reading, actually, just for the chapter titles. I'll say no more. And I've got Planet of the Ood and Waters of Mars lined up, because those are written by the authors of the serials, also, not serials, episodes. And they're easy reads. They're such light reads. But I also read Paul Theroux, who's the father of Louis Theroux, documentarian, British documentarian who's become very popular. He did a movie on Netflix called My Scientology Movie, which sort of lifts the lid on Scientology. But he's a very well-known documentarian in England, and his father is a writer. He wrote Mosquito Coast. Half Moon Street. But he writes a lot of travel books, and I've been reading his travel books because I can sort of hear the same voice as his son. And I also read Louis' brother is a novelist. His name is it Marcel Theroux? I can't remember, but he wrote a science fiction book about... It's got some crossover with Elephant Men because it's sort of putting your consciousness in another body. Excellent book. So, you know, I'm definitely a reader that sort of follows, like, okay, I like Louis, I'll read his dad. And then I've read a lot of his dad's work. I'm also reading Hunter Davis, who was the journalist who wrote the only official biography of the Beatles. And he was a favourite writer of mine in Punch in the Sunday Times, which you may not know what Punch is. It's kind of like New Yorker. And he wrote a book called Life in the Day about his life, which is very, very interesting. And I just bought his biography of the Beatles, so that's in my to-read pile.
I have a huge to-read pile.
There's too much to read. There's too much to watch. There's too much to read. We actually realised last night we hadn't watched the last episode of Loki because we went to England after episode 5 and just forgot. Because then there's what are we watching? Vigil, which is a British drama. The second series started. We're watching The Crown, you know, that came back on. Doctor Who came on. We're big fans of Strictly Come Dancing, which we watched after Doctor Who. There's so much to watch, and some of it's good. You know, I haven't got to see Godzilla -1 yet.
Me either.
We were going to see it with Andy yesterday, but he got sick.
Okay, I have one more question, and then we're going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to tell you a story. But my question is, what's your favorite font? That's your question. I stole it.
I felt bad that your dad wasn't going to be here because I was like, Brad is the kind of person who's like, we're driving and he'll just point to signs and he'll tell you what fonts things are.
I used to be able to do that. I'm very glad to tell you I got over it.
There's hope. There's hope for your dad.
My favourite font out there in the world is probably Antique Olive. I'm also fond of Verdana, which is in most Macs. But in terms of fonts that I've worked on or created, you know, Zoinks, which we created as the font to replace the Ren and Stimpy font, because the Ren and Stimpy font was very freely available in the 90s and it was everywhere. And I'm glad to say that Zoinks is now everywhere. You know, it's a strange question because I sort of wish the word font wasn't out there because to me it's lettering and it's elastic and it's manipulable. You know, most people load a font and they use it. I like to change it and stretch it and in Illustrator make it something else. In the same way that, you know, I can only draw lettering in a certain way, but I can then make it fit what I'm working on. I often correct people when they refer to lettering in comics in the 60s and 70s and they say, that's a nice font. It's like, it's not a font. It's lettering because it's hand-drawn. I think often the font that I'm working on, I'm doing titles for Conan right now in the style of Joe Rosen, who lettered a lot of Conan in the 70s. And I enjoy looking at his work across all his Marvel comics because he lettered Thor, he lettered every major title out there. And seeing how he worked by trying to imitate somebody's style, you learn something about the way they work that you can then only process through your own creativity. I look at lettering in a very different way, and ironically, I feel like all this work I've done over the last 30, 40 years, I'm now trying to work like somebody in the 60s, you know, which is like, oh, they had it right. It was so much simpler. You know.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with some more stuff.
All right, monkeying around, start talking.
Mr. Bobalina, Mr. Bob Bobalina, Mr. Bobalina.
About your podcast.
We talk about an Emmy-winning comedy series.
We talk about a band who outsold the Beatles and the Stones in 1967.
Still sticking to that story, huh? Well, if you know what's good for you, you'll change your tune.
We talk about a groundbreaking multimedia project
that inspired generations of artists and fans.
All right, throw the book at them.
This book is overdue.
Monkeying Around, a podcast about the monkeys.
And we're back. So, we are recording this not where we normally record, which is our home. We're recording at Infinity Flux, which is where I met you.
That's right.
It's the comic book store I work at. Before I worked here, there was a comics co-op, and that's where I saw you for the first time.
All right.
And I actually got a present from you for Christmas. I got Ghost World.
That's right.
Yeah, I thought it'd be funny if you'd sign it. You didn't work on that, did you?
No.
I think it'd be hilarious if you said it.
I could say for Joe. That's one of the last events we had.
Yeah. 2020 happened.
Yeah.
So I knew you worked on comics and stuff like that. I had no idea you worked on Doctor Who until I was watching like a special feature on the Seventh Doctor Blu-ray.
Where they skimmed over my time on that story.
But someone did mention you by name, and I was like,
it may have been Lee.
Yeah, I was like, is that the same person I know? And then I looked you up, and I was like, oh, wow, you've worked on a lot of Doctor Who. And
I was really pissed off when I saw that extra because they made no efforts to interview me. Maybe today they would because of Zoom, but everyone sort of seemed to refer to my period, and I don't think I was very popular amongst Doctor Who fans for doing crossovers with Death's Head and the Sleaze Brothers. But as Russell T Davies recently said, if fans don't like it, that's exactly what you should do.
Yeah. I'm just going to take parts of this podcast and edit it into that little video. The other thing I wanted to talk about, my dad would also come to
I thought you were going to ask me about this beautiful logo I designed.
You should ask about the logo.
Yeah.
Talk about the logo while I get this other thing pulled up.
Well, the history of that is that when I first saw the store sign, I thought it was a sunglasses hut because it has this little infinity sign in the logo. And I thought, oh, that's not a comic shop. That looks like a sunglasses hut. And I was just driving past. This is when we were looking for houses in Chattanooga. So ever since then, I've been trying to convince Jason and Megan to create a new logo, which finally they allowed me to do.
It's great. I love it.
I love it because it's all my favourite colours. So this is what's called Taxi Yellow. Has a little bit of red in it. It's not orange. It's Taxi Yellow, which works so brilliantly with blue. Do you recognise the style of the lettering?
It looks familiar.
Fantastic Four logo. So it's loosely based on the lettering from the Fantastic Four logo, which I think is one of the most fun Marvel logos.
It is very close. The colors is very close to the branding for the place that I work for now.
Well, there's only so many places you can go with complementary colours.
Yeah.
The colour wheel is not hundreds of colours. And for something to be legible, I like to use white. People forget that white is a colour. It's actually all the colours. Is it all the colours? Or the absence of colours. It's all the colours because when you spin the colour wheel, it goes white, right? When you spin a colour wheel, it goes white. The eye sees white. And white allows you to read a logo. If you put something against a white field, the black and the yellow can work really well.
Yeah, I feel like that's a big problem with some designs I've seen is they don't make the lettering pop out.
Yeah.
So it's hard to read. It
needs
becomes muddy.
to pop. That was something I was taught at Marvel UK, which is, does it pop? That Funko Pop logo pops. Pop! And what's it in? It's in a balloon.
That's true. So also at these comic co-ops, my father would come with me because he's a comic book artist. He wanted me to let you know he had some heart troubles recently, and he had to go back in to get a heart catheter thing done
during the pandemic,
which meant my mother couldn't go back with him, and he just wanted to let you know that this was his comfort object.
Reading material. Elephant Men.
Yeah, that was what accompanied him to the hospital.
Excellent.
Was Elephant Men. So
yeah, actually one of the best compliments I was paid recently was Tom King, who's writing Batman, Catwoman, a book called Everlasting Love. He's been the sort of hot writer at DC for a few years. We were at San Diego and we were walking over to the Comixology event, and he said, I just want to tell you, when I was in Afghanistan, I had 2 volumes of Elephant Man with me and I read them over and over again, and it really helped me get through that. And I was like, oh, can you write that down so I can put that on a cover of a volume, which he's not yet done. But, you never know how you might, affect someone, with what you've written, because you're always struggling to write the next thing. Mm-hmm. So it's always nice when something I wrote 15 years ago is being read today. I always encourage people to read The Beef, which is one of my favourite things that I've written. And certainly Megan and Jason really got behind that when it was on sale here in the store. But
I haven't read that one yet, but I have read the first volume of Ask for Mercy.
Ask for Mercy?
Mm-hmm.
Did you enjoy it?
I did. It was very good, yeah.
Did you notice the Doctor Who overlaps?
What's the Doctor Who
overlaps? It's time travel.
That's true.
It's hard for me to get away from time travel. The first Hip Flask story is a time travel story. And you got to remember, I wrote that 25 years ago, before all this crazy amount of TV that's based in time travel and multiverses. If I'd worked with a faster artist, I'd maybe be able to take credit for some of it. But,
multiverses are having a moment right now.
I hope it passes.
I feel you. So before we go, is there anything you want to plug?
Ask for Mercy and Elephant Men, the trade paperback collections of the Comixology original series came out this year. Volumes 2 come out next year. But actually follow me on Facebook because we're doing a lot of Kickstarters next year. There's going to be a book that I've put together in memory of Tim Sale with some work that he started and some friends of mine are finishing. But it's sort of a epilogue to the book I did with him called Tim Sale Black and White, always available on Amazon or at your local comic book store.
Infinity Flux.
They will order it for you. That's one of my favorite books that I've put together because that's when Tim and I really became friends. I sat down with him and said, people need to know your story because he started working late in his 20s in comics. He was a late developer in terms of he wasn't some punk-ass kid at 18 that started drawing comics. He took his time and was very deliberate, and I really appreciate that about his career. The Beef, always available on Amazon or at your local comic store.
Infinity Flux.
Axel and I have finished 2 issues of Elephant Men since we finished with originals. One of them will be a Kickstarter. Another one is an epilogue to the Hip Flask story that I started in 2001, which the artist Ladrone is finishing issue 5. It's taken him 12 years. But we'll be putting together a collection of that next year. And again, that will be a Kickstarter. There's a lot of work to come. I've also been curating my library on Comixology and Amazon Print on Demand. So there's actually 3 new collections, not new material. Some of it is new material because Axel, who's my regular artist on Elephant Men, has redrawn some early issues of Elephant Men, and we've packaged them differently to be in shorter trade paperback collections, and they're only available print on demand through Amazon. There's 2 Elephant Men 2239 collections. One is called War Toys, one is called Enemy Species, and there's a Elephant Men 2259 collection called Man-Made Monsters. There'll be 2 more next year. The beauty of print on demand is you can curate your library, which I have complete control over, and put them out in new editions with new covers. And they've all got new covers by Ian Churchill, who's a top comic book artist and a good friend of mine. And I'm sort of enjoying my sort of retrospective career on Elephant Men by sort of adding and subtracting from the canon.
Is there a lot of subtracting? Or?
Only in that some issues didn't come out the way I wanted to. And, the beauty of being the creator of the work is that you don't have to wait for Hollywood or Netflix to revise your work. You can see its shortcomings and work on them, So there are storylines that I wish I'd foreshadowed.
Oh, okay.
And now I can. If somebody comes across those collections on Amazon, then they don't know.
That's true.
I mean, I don't know. We could get into the whole George Lucas special editions, which I was fine with. I mean, just for that shot of the Millennium Falcon taking off in Star Wars. Remember, that they didn't show it take off, and they added this scene in, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's the Millennium Falcon taking off. It's worth it. Star Wars is a whole other can of worms.
We'll have to get Andy in here for that.
But if you're the creator of the work, you have every right to revise it. Because it's just like going back to a painting. We don't know how much extra work Leonardo did on the Mona Lisa. We don't know if he went back to it after it was finished. The artist has the right to revise his own work, and nobody should tell him different. And of course, that's not the world we live in. But
people will have opinions.
Yeah, and I was working with a great artist called Moritat. He quit after like 9 or 10 issues. What I realized was that he was taking shortcuts that caused me to take. When you see that your artist is taking shortcuts, you start making the story smaller. And I finally found Axel, and Axel will draw anything. He can draw a city. He doesn't do a close-up on the city with a few buildings in the background. He draws the entire city. He was trained as an architect. He was young enough that I could train him the way I trained artists at Marvel UK. And we were trained by Jim Shooter and Tom DeFalco to make comics the Marvel way. And there's a lot of things that I see in comics today and I realized about my own comics. For instance, first 100 issues of Spider-Man, try finding one that doesn't feature Spider-Man full figure. There's maybe one or two. That is deliberate editorial policy. And I remember discovering that for myself when I was working on Action Force. If you print in a children's comic, and children, I say 7 to 16 is sort of your audience. If you print a picture of Snake Eyes where he's full figure, every limb, every finger, every digit, every hairline, not that he has a hairline, you'll get 20 copies of that drawing in the mail that week. If you have an issue where nobody's shown full figure, no art comes in. Because we're always looking for all the information.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at Spider-Man and when you look at old Marvel comics that were guided by Stan Lee and, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, they knew that. Either they discussed it or they just knew it intuitively. And a lot of great artists know it intuitively because they want all the information. They want to say, I drew all of Batman.
Right.
Even if they cheat a bit, start looking at the great movie posters, the great comic book covers, just great art, and thinking, what can I see? And what do I want to see? There's another key thing in comics, which is that we're always looking for the eyes. We're always looking for people's expressions. So if we don't see the eyes, it's either they're concealing the identity of Dr. Doom or whoever. But it's very frustrating when we don't see the eyes. And if you watch a movie and you don't see the character's face for a long time, notice how you feel about that. There's a lot to be said for teaching artists what makes a great comic work. Great comic book artists tend to be checking all those boxes anyway. But I was reading something yesterday. It was a Hellboy story. I think it was a Christmas story. And you don't see Hellboy's feet till like page 10. And it really bothered me. And that's the joke. Jim Shooter used to say, how do you know he's not wearing roller skates? And that's the joke, but it's a joke because it's true. We want to know, is he wearing roller skates?
I now want to make a
see his
comic
eyes.
where 10 pages in it's revealed that they're wearing roller skates the entire time.
A lot of comedy is based on lack of expectation or forced expectation. A lot of comedy is based on what you think is going to happen, and then you suddenly see that they are wearing roller skates, that the Daleks are wearing roller skates.
There you go.
I think you should give another plug to Infinity Flux for letting us record here.
Infinity Flux.
Great. No notes.
It is, they don't need me to say this, but it is easily the best comic book store in this area, probably in Tennessee.
The world.
If not the world. I've signed at a lot of comic book stores the world over. I'm a big fan of Traveling Man in England because they really know how to, if you're not customer oriented, you're dead in the water. And there are some stores in this area that are not customer oriented. I won't mention them. But what I love about Infinity Flux is that great youthful energy, family focused, collector oriented as well. All the games, as you know, I pick up Magic the Gathering sets for my son. It's just a nice place to be. And I think a lot of stores forget that you need to make a store attractive. You need to make people feel like you can come into a comic book store and not know anything. It shouldn't be any kind of sort of elitist mentality. And some stores do have that kind of if you don't know what you want to read, why are you here? It's right. It's new reader friendly, it's collector friendly, it's just a friendly store. So, and a great sort of family feeling to it too.
I enjoy working here, so thanks to Infinity Flux for letting us film here too, record here. They're on the internet at infinityflux.net, so you can buy stuff from them and they'll ship it to you.
Probably
and
be the one who's shipping it.
And they have a Facebook Live every Sunday selling collector's items, so look them up.
We got a lot of cool stuff going on. Also, if you like this episode of the podcast, check out more on Watch-A-Rassilon.com. You can also find our podcast, our Patreon, and more at Linktree/Watch-A-Thon. And I want to give a special shout out to Vince and EL for providing us with our amazing theme song.
Thank you, Vince.
And check out more of their music at vincentel.bandcamp.com. And tune in next month when we talk about New Earth.
When are we going to do Blink?
When we get to it. Yeah. Richard's going to be back with Blink for like a proper, like a regular episode.
A Watch-A-Thon.
Yeah. And just talking about our thoughts on Blink.
Hey, we didn't direct it commentary.
Yeah. But until next time, keep calm and wrestle on.
goodbye, and I love you in a platonic, parasocial way.
Bye, guys. Thanks for listening, watching, / paying attention.
Putting it in your ear holes.
Infinity Flux.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.